I was making my morning coffee when I heard unfamiliar voices upstairs. "Welcome to your weekend getaway," someone said cheerfully. I climbed the stairs to find 5 strangers in my guest bedroom, unpacking suitcases and taking selfies. "Excuse me," I said, "who are you and why are you in my house?" They looked confused and showed me their phones. My own home was listed on Airbnb as Cozy Victorian Retreat, perfect for groups, with my son David as the host. My name is Jordan Mills, and at 71 years old, I thought I'd seen every possible way life could surprise me. I'd lived through my husband's death 5 years ago, raised 3 children as a single mother after that, and survived the challenge of aging in Brooklyn where everything seemed to get more expensive by the month. But nothing had prepared me for the moment when I discovered that my own son had turned my house into a commercial hotel operation without my knowledge. It was a crisp Saturday morning in October, and I was following my usual routine in my Park Slope brownstone. The house had been in my family for 40 years. My late husband Marcus and I had bought it when the neighborhood was still affordable, back when artists and teachers could live here instead of just tech executives and hedge fund managers. It was a beautiful 4-story Victorian that Marcus had lovingly restored, with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and the kind of architectural details that made people stop and take pictures. I lived primarily on the first floor now, using the kitchen, living room, and the small bedroom we'd converted from Marcus's study after his knees got too bad for the stairs. The upper floors had become harder for me to navigate regularly, so I'd left them largely as they were, furnished guest rooms and storage space filled with the accumulated memories of 4 decades. That's why the voices from upstairs were so startling. I set down my coffee mug and listened carefully. There were definitely people up there, multiple people, talking and laughing like they belonged. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but burglars don't usually announce their presence so cheerfully. I climbed the stairs slowly, my arthritis making each step a deliberate effort, and followed the sounds to what had been my daughter Sarah's old bedroom. The door was open, and inside I found 5 young people in their 20s, spreading out sleeping bags and hanging clothes in the closet like they were moving in. "Excuse me," I said from the doorway, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Who are you, and why are you in my house?" The group turned to look at me with expressions of confusion rather than guilt. A young woman with bright purple hair stepped forward holding her smartphone. "Oh, hi, you must be the cleaning lady David mentioned. I'm Emma, and we're here for our Airbnb weekend. We booked the Cozy Victorian Retreat for 3 nights. She showed me her phone screen, and I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. There was my house, my front steps, my garden, my distinctive red door with the brass knocker Marcus had installed. The listing was titled Cozy Victorian Retreat, perfect for groups, with professional quality photos of my upper floors that I didn't remember anyone taking. The host was listed as David M., with a 5-star rating and dozens of glowing reviews. "This is impossible," I said, taking the phone to look more closely. "This is my house. I live here. I own this house." Emma's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Oh no, did David not tell you we were coming? He said his mom lives downstairs and that she's totally cool with guests. He said you sometimes even make breakfast for visitors if they ask nicely." My son David, my youngest child, the one I'd helped through college, the one who'd moved back in with me after his divorce 2 years ago because he couldn't afford his own place in the city, the one who'd been helping me with household management and had access to every key, every room, every aspect of my life. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Emma consulted her phone. "David's been hosting here for looks like 8 months. He has incredible reviews. Listen to this one. David's mom's house is a beautiful Victorian gem in the heart of Brooklyn. The host is super responsive, and the location is perfect for exploring the city. The elderly owner is sweet and doesn't mind guests at all. 8 months. For 8 months, my son had been running a commercial hotel operation in my house while I lived downstairs, completely unaware that strangers were sleeping in the rooms above my head, using my utilities, my Wi-Fi, my water, my electricity. I'd been paying to support an illegal business I didn't know existed. "I need you all to leave," I said, my voice steady despite the shock. "There's been a mistake. David had no right to rent out these rooms." "But we paid $300 a night for 3 nights," protested a young man with a Harvard sweatshirt. "We can't get that money back, and all the hotels in Brooklyn are booked for the weekend." "That's not my problem," I said firmly. "This is my house, and I'm telling you to leave." What followed was 20 minutes of increasingly tense negotiation. The guests showed me their reservation confirmations, their payment receipts, their communication with David M. about check-in procedures and house rules. They'd paid nearly $1,000 for their weekend, and they had no intention of leaving quietly. Finally, I did what I should have done immediately. I called my son. "David," I said when he answered, "there are 5 strangers in my house who say you rented them rooms through Airbnb. Please tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding." There was a long pause. "Mom, I can explain everything. I was going to tell you about it, but I wanted to surprise you with how much extra income we could generate from the empty rooms." "Get over here right now," I said, and hung up. David arrived 30 minutes later, carrying coffee and pastries like he was coming to a friendly brunch instead of an emergency family meeting. He was dressed in his usual weekend outfit, expensive jeans and a designer sweater that I'd always wondered how he could afford on his freelance graphic design income. Now I was beginning to understand. "Mom, before you get upset, let me show you the numbers," he said, pulling out his laptop and spreading papers across my kitchen table. "In 8 months, we've generated over $40,000 in rental income. That's enough to cover your property taxes, utilities, and still have money left over for maintenance and improvements." I stared at him, this 35-year-old man who looked so much like his father but lacked every ounce of Marcus's integrity. "David, you've been running a hotel in my house without my permission. Do you understand that what you've done is illegal?" "It's not illegal, Mom. Airbnb is a legitimate platform. And technically, since I live here, I have the right to host guests. You live in the basement apartment. You don't have the right to rent out my guest bedrooms." David opened his laptop and pulled up a spreadsheet. "Look at these numbers, Mom. We're averaging $1,200 a week in gross revenue. After Airbnb's fees and cleaning costs, we're still netting about $800 a week. That's over $3,000 a month in pure profit." Profit from what? From lying to people? From pretending to own a house that belongs to me? I never said I owned the house. The listing clearly states that it's a family property and that my mom lives downstairs. Most guests think it's charming. I looked at the reviews he'd pulled up on his phone. Guest after guest praising the authentic Brooklyn experience and the sweet elderly owner who adds to the charm. Some mentioned waving to me through windows or seeing me in the garden. A few even mentioned that I'd said hello when they were coming and going. David, these people think I'm part of the experience. They think I'm some quaint old lady who's happy to have strangers traipsing through my house. Aren't you, though? Mom, you've been lonely since Dad died. You barely use the upstairs rooms. The guests bring life to the house. Some of them have told me how much they enjoyed chatting with you in the garden. I remembered now, the friendly young couples I'd encountered on my front steps, the people who'd complimented my flowers and asked about the neighborhood. I'd thought they were friends of David's or perhaps people he was dating. I'd been polite, even welcoming, not realizing I was providing customer service for his illegal business. "How much money have you made?" I asked. David hesitated. "Well, the gross revenue has been about $40,000, but there are expenses." "How much have you kept for yourself?" "Mom, I've been managing everything. The bookings, the communications, the cleaning coordination, the key exchanges. It's basically a full-time job." "How much, David?" "About $30,000, he admitted. $30,000. In 8 months, my son had generated $30,000 in profit by secretly commercializing my home. Meanwhile, I'd been paying increased utility bills, higher water bills, more wear and tear on my property, and dealing with the stress of constant noise and activity upstairs without understanding the source. David, what you've done isn't just wrong, it's theft. You've been using my property to generate income for yourself without my consent. That's fraud. Mom, you're being dramatic. I was planning to split the profits with you. I just wanted to get the operation running smoothly first. And the taxes? Have you been reporting this income? Have you been paying the city's hotel taxes? Do you have the proper licenses and insurance for commercial lodging? David's expression shifted, and I saw a flicker of panic. Those are just bureaucratic details. Everyone on Airbnb operates the same way. No, David, those are legal requirements, and you've been violating all of them while using my property as collateral. I thought about the 5 strangers upstairs waiting to see if they'd be allowed to stay for their paid weekend. I thought about the dozens of previous guests who'd stayed in my house, people I'd never met but who'd been sleeping 20 feet above my bedroom. I thought about the liability, the risk, the sheer audacity of what my son had done. David, this stops now, today. You're going to cancel every future bookings, refund any money that needs to be refunded, and shut down this operation immediately. Mom, you don't understand what you're asking. I have bookings through New Year's. Some people have already paid for Christmas week. If I cancel everything, I'll have to refund thousands of dollars I've already spent. Then you'd better figure out how to get that money back, because this ends today. David stood up abruptly, his conciliatory tone evaporating. You know what, Mom? You should be thanking me. This house has been sitting here half empty while you live like a hermit downstairs. I've brought in enough money to completely cover your expenses and still have profit left over. Without me, you'd be struggling to afford the property taxes on this place. Without you, I'd have my privacy, my security, and my peace of mind. Without me, you'd be alone in this big house talking to yourself and watching game shows all day. At least the Airbnb guests bring some life to this place. The cruelty of that comment, the dismissive way he characterized my life since his father's death, cut deeper than the financial betrayal. Get out, I said quietly. What? Get out of my house, now. Take your things and leave. Mom, you're overreacting. Let's talk about this rationally. David, you have been lying to me for 8 months. You've been using my home for commercial purposes without my knowledge or consent. You've exposed me to liability, tax violations, and regulatory violations. You've stolen thousands of dollars from me. And just now, when I confronted you about it, you insulted me and dismissed my concerns. I want you out of my house. David stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something ugly flicker across his features. Fine, he said, but if I leave, the Airbnb operation leaves with me. Hope you can afford this place on your Social Security. I'll manage, I said. After David left, I went upstairs to deal with the guests who were still waiting for resolution. They were understandably frustrated, but I offered to help them find alternative accommodations and refund their money from my own resources rather than leave them stranded. It cost me nearly $1,000, but it was the right thing to do. After the guests left and David had packed his belongings from the basement apartment, I sat in my quiet house and tried to process what had happened. The silence felt different now, not peaceful, but hollow. Every creak of the floorboards above made me wonder who might be up there, even though I knew the rooms were empty. I spent the evening going through David's abandoned paperwork, trying to understand the scope of his operation. What I found was both impressive and terrifying in its thoroughness. He'd created a complete business around my home, with professional photographs, detailed guest instructions, cleaning schedules, and even a guidebook to Brooklyn attractions. The financial records were meticulously kept. In 8 months, he'd hosted 127 different bookings, ranging from single nights to week-long stays. The average booking was $280 per night, and he'd maintained an occupancy rate of nearly 70%. It was, I had to admit, a remarkably successful business, built entirely on property he didn't own and without the knowledge of the actual owner. But the more I read, the more concerned I became about the legal implications. David had been operating a commercial lodging business without any of the required permits or licenses. He hadn't been collecting or remitting the city's hotel occupancy taxes. He had no commercial insurance to cover potential liability issues. And most importantly, he'd been doing all of this in a residential building in a neighborhood that wasn't zoned for commercial lodging. I called my neighbor Helen, an attorney who'd retired from a practice specializing in real estate law. "Jordan, what David did could get you in serious trouble with the city," she said after I'd explained the situation. "Short-term rentals like Airbnb have very specific regulations in New York, and most residential buildings aren't allowed to operate as hotels. If the city finds out about this, you could face thousands of dollars in fines." But I didn't know anything about it. That might not matter. As the property owner, you're ultimately responsible for how your property is used. The city doesn't care if your son was operating without your knowledge. They'll hold you liable for the violations. Helen came over that evening and helped me review the legal situation. It was worse than I'd imagined. David had not only violated city regulations about short-term rentals, but he'd also potentially violated building codes, tax laws, and zoning restrictions. If the city decided to investigate, I could be facing tens of thousands of dollars in fines and penalties. "The first thing you need to do is document everything," Helen advised. "Print out all the Airbnb listings, save all the guest communications, gather all the financial records. If this becomes a legal issue, you'll need to prove that David was operating without your knowledge or consent. And then what? Then you report him to the authorities. Jordan, what David did isn't just unethical, it's criminal. He committed fraud by using your property for commercial purposes without your consent. He evaded taxes by not reporting the income properly. He exposed you to liability by operating an unlicensed lodging business. You need to protect yourself." That night, I lay in bed, listening to the silence of my house and thinking about my son. David had always been the charmer of my 3 children, the one with big dreams and elaborate plans. But he'd also always been the one who bent rules, who found shortcuts, who believed that asking forgiveness was easier than asking permission. I'd excused it when he was young, thinking it showed creativity and entrepreneurial spirit. Now I realized it had grown into something much darker. I spent the next week gathering evidence and documentation. Helen helped me navigate the maze of city agencies that had jurisdiction over different aspects of David's violations. The Department of Buildings handled zoning and safety issues. The Department of Finance dealt with tax violations. The Department of Consumer Affairs regulated short-term rentals. Each agency had different forms, different requirements, different penalties. The picture that emerged was sobering. David had violated at least a dozen different regulations, some of which carried penalties of up to $25,000 per violation. If the city chose to pursue maximum enforcement, I could be looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines, money I absolutely didn't have. But Helen discovered something that might help me. New York had recently passed legislation specifically addressing situations where property owners were unaware of illegal short-term rental operations. If I could prove that David had operated without my knowledge and that I'd taken immediate action to stop the violations once I discovered them, I might be able to avoid the most severe penalties. "The key is showing that you were a victim, not a willing participant," Helen explained. "We need to demonstrate that David deceived you and that you acted responsibly once you learned the truth." I filed complaints with multiple city agencies documenting David's unauthorized use of my property for commercial purposes. I provided all the financial records showing that he'd kept the rental income for himself. I submitted testimony from the guests who'd confirmed that they believed David was the authorized host and that I was merely a resident family member. The hardest part was filing the police report. Sitting in the detective's office, explaining that my own son had defrauded me felt like the ultimate admission of failure as a mother. Detective Rosa Martinez listened patiently as I described the situation. "Mrs. Mills, I know this is difficult, but what your son did is a clear case of theft and fraud. He used your property to generate income without your consent, and he kept that income for himself. The amount involved, $30,000, makes this a felony. What happens now? We'll investigate and likely file charges. Your son will have the opportunity to return the money and cooperate with the city agencies to resolve the regulatory violations. If he does that, the prosecutor might be willing to consider a plea agreement. If he doesn't, she shrugged, then this goes to trial. I left the police station feeling sick. I'd just initiated criminal proceedings against my own child. But I also felt something else, a sense of protection, of having finally drawn a line that couldn't be crossed. 3 days after I filed the police report, David showed up at my door. He looked terrible, unshaven, tired, wearing the same clothes I'd seen him in when he moved out. Behind him stood a woman I didn't recognize, professionally dressed and carrying a briefcase. "Mom, this is Sarah Chin, my attorney," David said without preamble. "We need to talk." I let them in, though every instinct told me not to. Sarah Chin was young, probably in her 30s, with the kind of aggressive confidence that suggested she was expensive. "Mrs. Mills," she began before I'd even offered them seats, "my client is prepared to make a very generous offer to resolve this situation without further legal proceedings." "I'm listening." David pulled out a manila folder. "Mom, I've been able to secure a loan to repay all the rental income, $30,000 plus interest. In exchange, you agree to drop the criminal charges and tell the city agencies that we've resolved the matter privately. And the fines I might have to pay because of your violations? We'll split them 50-50, Sarah Chen said. David acknowledges that his actions created liability for you, but you also benefited from the improvements he made to the property and the cleaning and maintenance that was done as part of the rental operation." I stared at them. "You want me to pay for fines resulting from crimes I didn't know were being committed?" "Mom, be reasonable," David said. "If this goes to court, you're going to end up paying lawyers' fees and court costs either way. This way, we both take responsibility and move forward." "David, you stole from me. You used my home for commercial purposes without my permission for 8 months. You exposed me to legal liability that could cost me my house. And now you want me to pay half the penalty for your crimes?" Sarah Chen leaned forward. "Mrs. Mills, you need to understand that the criminal charges against my client are questionable at best. David was living in your home with your permission. He made improvements to the property. He can argue that he reasonably believed he had implied consent to use the space commercially. That's ridiculous. Maybe, but it's a viable defense. And if this goes to trial, a lot of uncomfortable questions are going to be asked about your awareness of the situation. Neighbors are going to testify about seeing constant streams of visitors. Utility companies are going to provide records showing dramatically increased usage. A prosecutor might argue that it's implausible you didn't know what was happening in your own home." The threat was clear. If I didn't accept their offer, they'd try to make me look like a willing participant who was now trying to avoid responsibility. It was a familiar David pattern. Create a problem, then blame others when consequences arrived. "I need time to think about this," I said. "Of course," Sarah replied, standing. "But I should mention that this offer is time-sensitive. If criminal charges are formally filed, my client's options become much more limited." After they left, I called Helen immediately. "They're trying to intimidate you," she said after I described the meeting. "Sarah Chen is a defense attorney specializing in white-collar crime. She's expensive, which means David either borrowed money to hire her or she's working on contingency expecting a big payoff. Could they really argue that I knew about the Airbnb operation? They could try, but the evidence doesn't support it. You have documentation showing that you discovered the operation by accident, that you immediately demanded it stop, and that you took legal action as soon as you understood the scope of the problem. Any reasonable person would believe your account. So what do I do? You stick to your guns. David committed crimes and he needs to face the consequences. If you let him negotiate his way out of this, he'll just find new ways. 2 weeks later, I received a visit from Inspector Williams from the Department of Buildings. He was a tired-looking man in his 50s, who'd clearly seen every possible variation of housing violations in his career. "Mrs. Mills, we're investigating reports of illegal commercial activity at this address," he said, consulting a tablet. "According to our records, this property has been operating as an unlicensed short-term rental facility." I invited him in and showed him the documentation I'd prepared, the Airbnb listings, the financial records, the police report, everything that proved David had operated without my knowledge. Inspector Williams walked through the house, taking photographs and making notes. The upper floor still showed signs of their commercial use: extra towels in the closets, laminated instructions on the walls, professional quality amenities in the bathrooms. "Mrs. Mills, I have to ask, how could you not know this was happening? According to the Airbnb records, you had guests staying here almost every weekend for 8 months." I'd been dreading this question, but I'd prepared for it. "Inspector Williams, I'm 71 years old, and I live primarily on the first floor of this house. My son told me that the people I occasionally saw were friends visiting him, or people he was interviewing for freelance work. I trusted him. I had no reason to think he was running a commercial operation. And the increased utility bills, the extra wear and tear on the property? My son told me he was paying for increased utilities because he was working from home more. As for wear and tear, I rarely went upstairs, so I didn't notice changes." Inspector Williams reviewed my documentation carefully. After an hour, he closed his tablet and looked at me seriously. "Mrs. Mills, based on the evidence you've provided, it appears that you were the victim of your son's unauthorized commercial use of your property. However, the violations still occurred, and the city still has to address them." "What does that mean?" "It means we're going to fine you for the violations, but we're also going to recommend that the fines be reduced to the minimum allowable amounts given your cooperation and victim status. Instead of $25,000 per violation, you're looking at about $5,000 total." $5,000. It was still a significant amount on my fixed income, but it was manageable. More importantly, it was recognition that I'd been deceived rather than complicit. "What about my son?" "That's between him and the criminal justice system. Our job is just to address the building code violations." After Inspector Williams left, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that I wouldn't be facing financial ruin because of David's crimes. Sadness that it had come to this: city inspectors investigating my home, fines to pay, criminal charges against my own child. David's criminal trial began 4 months later. By then, I'd paid the city fines and tried to return my life to normal. But normal felt different now. I'd installed new locks and a security system. I'd changed my Wi-Fi password and been more cautious about who I let into my home. The trust that had been broken went deeper than just my relationship with David. It extended to my sense of security in my own space. Sarah Chen had advised David to reject the prosecutor's plea offer, gambling that a jury would be sympathetic to a young man who'd been trying to help his elderly mother generate income from unused space. It was a miscalculation. The prosecution presented a clear case of fraud and theft. They showed the Airbnb listings that identified David as the host, without mentioning that he didn't own the property. They presented financial records showing that he'd kept all the rental income. They called guests who testified that David had presented himself as the property owner or manager, never mentioning that he was using his mother's home without permission. Most damaging was David's own testimony. Under cross-examination, he admitted that he'd never explicitly asked my permission to start the Airbnb operation. He acknowledged that he'd kept all the rental income for himself. He confirmed that he'd told guests I was a sweet old lady who lived downstairs and was happy to have visitors. "Mr. Mills," the prosecutor asked, "did you ever consider that your mother might not want strangers sleeping in her home without her knowledge?" "I thought she'd be happy about the extra income," David replied. "But you never gave her any of that income, did you?" "I was planning to." "For 8 months you were planning to? What were you waiting for?" David had no good answer. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: theft, fraud, and operating an unlicensed commercial business. The judge sentenced him to 2 years probation, restitution of the $30,000 plus damages, and 200 hours of community service. "Mr. Mills," the judge said during sentencing, "you betrayed your mother's trust and exploited her home for your own financial gain. The fact that the victim is your own mother makes this crime particularly reprehensible. You're fortunate that your mother's intervention prevented this from becoming an even more serious situation." I didn't feel victorious watching my son get sentenced. I felt hollow, exhausted, and sad about what our family had become. It's been 2 years since I discovered David's Airbnb operation. He's completed his probation and community service, and he's repaid most of the money he stole, though I've donated it all to a local organization that helps elderly people avoid financial exploitation. David and I have no contact now. He sends me a birthday card each year, but we don't speak or see each other. My other children, Sarah and Michael, were horrified when they learned what their brother had done, but they've struggled with the aftermath too. Family gatherings are awkward when one child is permanently excluded. Holidays feel incomplete. The family dynamic that took decades to build was shattered in a matter of months. But there have been positive changes too. The house feels like mine again in a way it hadn't for years. I've learned more about technology and digital security. I've become involved with local organizations that educate seniors about various forms of financial exploitation. I share my story as a cautionary tale about trusting family members with financial access. Most importantly, I've reclaimed my independence. For years after Marcus died, I'd been grateful for David's help with household management and technology. I'd become dependent on him in ways that made me vulnerable to his manipulation. Now I handle my own affairs, make my own decisions, and trust my own judgment. The house is quieter now, but it's a peaceful quiet rather than the hollow silence I felt immediately after David left. I filled the upstairs rooms with art supplies and books, turning them into spaces for my own interests rather than letting them sit empty. I've started having friends over for dinner again, people who visit because I invite them, not because they've paid for the privilege. Sometimes I think about the Airbnb guests who stayed in my home without my knowledge. Most of them were probably decent people who had no idea they were participating in a fraud. I hope they enjoyed their visits to Brooklyn, even though the circumstances were wrong. I also think about the broader implications of what David did. How many other elderly homeowners are being exploited by family members who have access to their property? How many people are unknowingly hosting illegal commercial operations in their homes? How many children see their aging parents' assets as opportunities rather than trusts to be protected? I'm Jordan Mills. I'm 73 years old now, and I saved my home from my own son. The house he tried to turn into a commercial hotel is now truly mine again, quiet, secure, and filled with people who are there because I want them there, not because they paid to be there. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones we trust completely. Sometimes protecting yourself means prosecuting the people you love. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't getting justice, it's getting your peace back. The Airbnb listing for my house has been permanently removed. The only guests who sleep here now are the ones I invite. And that's exactly how it should be.